The Gospel on the 18th Sunday of Ordinary Time gives us an account of Jesus feeding the multitude in the desert. A very familiar story, for it is repeated 6 times in the Gospels. A repetition that often draws our attention to the action and words that speak about the Eucharistic institution expressed and celebrated at the Last Supper. Yet, Matthew draws our attention to another important element of this gospel narrative. Though the miracles of the loaves and fishes appear in all 4 gospels, it is only in Matthew that Jesus withdraws to a deserted place to deal with his grief over the death of John the Baptist. It seemed that Jesus needed some time away in order to refocus his ministry. Instead of finding the quiet he longed for, the crowds found him. The Gospel tells us when he went ashore, Jesus saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them. Important to remember that the biblical definition of the word compassion is to suffer with. Someone else's heartbreak becomes your heartbreak. Another's suffering becomes your suffering. The sight of the distressed people called Jesus beyond his own need, and moved by compassion, Jesus spent the whole day attending to the people. Even though the disciples witnessed Jesus' compassion for the crowds gathered around him, they did not perceive the nourishing power of his self-giving love. For when it was evening, they tell Jesus to send the hungry crowd away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. A practical solution to a difficult problem, which is turned upside down when Jesus invites them to give them something to eat. Actually, Jesus is inviting the disciples to follow his example of unsparing generosity, to give away everything they had, even as they feared they had too little to offer. With compassion and generosity, Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, and blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. The Gospel goes on to say that more than 5,000 people ate and were filled, and even reported that there were 12 baskets of leftovers. On hearing this account of Jesus feeding the multitude in the desert, I always wondered about what the disciples witnessed and experienced as they shared their food with the people. Did Jesus' self-emptying inspire others in the crowd to acts of compassion and generosity? Did the crowd's acts of self-emptying inspire the disciples to follow Jesus with the generosity and faith that gives all for the sake of others? Yet the more important question we need to ask ourselves today is, are we transformed by Jesus' miracle of self-emptying love? As we experience this gift, are we more mindful of God's unconditional and overwhelming love active and present in our world? When with gratitude we experience this unearned gift, it has the power to make us kind, merciful, compassionate, and concerned about the well-being of the other. When we allow this blessing, breaking, and sharing action of Jesus to challenge our response as we encounter the suffering and heartache of people around us, we become signs of God's unconditional and overwhelming love. Let me tell you a story about a woman who was inspired by this gospel. Virgie was a wise native elder I met while I was living in a small Indigenous community in northern Canada. Her life had been hard, difficult, and painful, but she had a big heart full of compassion, a woman who was transformed by the self-emptying love of Jesus and who lived the Eucharist in a way that transformed her community. When anyone came to Virgie because they had no food, she would empty her fridge and freezer and give everything she had. At times, I would caution her to keep some for herself because she didn't have much and often struggled to meet her own needs. But she would scold me with a frown and tell me to trust in God's goodness and love. Even when members of the community would tell her that the people asking for help had spent all their money foolishly and therefore didn't deserve any help, didn't stop her from doing so, because her compassion allowed someone else's heartbreak to become her heartbreak, another's suffering to become her suffering. When she helped people in need, they experienced God's unconditional and overwhelming love. Today, as we open our hands and our hearts to the food which nourishes us and to the love which sustains us, may we become bread, blessed, broken, and shared for our world. May our self-emptying actions, inspired by the Eucharist, help us to experience God's unconditional and overwhelming love. God bless. Take care and stay well.